Okay, so good day everybody, and welcome to today's 10ZiG webinar on an introduction to management and best practices of 10ZiG's latest Linux version 16.5 firmware for 10ZiG's NOS, PeakOS and RepurpOS operating systems. So my name is Stuart Hales. I'm pre-sales engineer for 10ZiG, based predominantly from our UK Leicester office, and I will be your host and presenter for today. But also joining me on this session is Mr. Ed Richardson, Head of Technical Services for 10ZiG US, who will join us at the end for the Q&A. There are some marketing handouts which have been uploaded and available to you all to download and view. The webinar will also be recorded, and we'll also post a follow-up video of the recording to both our 10ZiG YouTube channels and also to our 10ZiG video gallery on our website. Just be aware that we have seen in previous webinars that there can be some attendees that encounter some audio issues. So if you do encounter that, then put a message in the chat. But then also please remember that you can always refer back to the video afterwards, which is posted on one of those locations mentioned before. So attendees will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And we will have some time for Q&A at the end of the webinar to answer some of those questions. If there are any questions not answered, then we will follow up all of those post the webinar finishing. So there will be some poll questions, mainly related to marketing. So we do appreciate you participating in these and the insights that they provide to us. Okay, so for this webinar, we're going to be covering the 4 pillars of what I would suggest are important to a good VDI end user computing solution. So we want to have a solution that is easy, ideally so you can focus your time and efforts on other areas. That is not to say that zero and thin clients are not important, as they certainly are, being the interface between the user and the VDI environment. But the zero and thin client solution should be relatively easy to deploy, allowing for automatic, almost automatic zero-touch deployment. So we're going to be covering how to get your clients connected to the manager using one of the discovery mechanisms mentioned here in the first column under discovery. And then we're going to look at grouping them effectively in order to maximize the groups in order to configure the clients automatically. So that will deal with a new 10ZiG solution deployment. Then we're going to look at ongoing maintenance of those devices once they are deployed. So things like configuration changes, how they can be managed, also firmware updates and the scheduling of potentially remote operations. Another key pillar is to do with supporting of your end user computing solution and also your actual users themselves. So being able to control the clients remotely and also being able to shadow them to provide support to end users, including their VDI session if necessary, and also aiding in any troubleshooting through centralized retrieval of login information when issues do arise. So we'll look at those aspects there. And then finally, the last sort of pillar, as mentioned, basically relates to security. So although that is by no means the least important, here we're really going to be focusing on your clients and in terms of remote management security through the cloud connector, and also because we're using the 16.5 firmware from a management perspective, the web console security as well. So just a little bit of an introduction for the webinar. So some information about us if you're not already aware of 10ZiG. So we are a solely focused thin and zero client vendor. So what this means is that we are specialists in what we do and can offer a complete end user computing solution, including zero and thin client hardware, also in-house Linux developed VDI optimized operating systems, as well as offering Windows 10 IoT thin clients and Teradici options. So all of this, or all of these products can be managed using our 10ZiG Manager endpoint management suite. So our global headquarters is based in the USA in Phoenix, Arizona, and we also have an EMEA head office, which is based in Leicester in the UK. 10ZiG was founded back in 2003, so this year actually we have been celebrating 20 years in the industry. So with that in mind, we have got long-standing relationships with all the leading VDI partners, so including Citrix, VMware and Microsoft, for example, and that is an ongoing relationship. We've also got full certification, so this is for our thin and zero client hardware for the different VDI platforms. And also we've got certified staff in both of our sales and technical teams for the different VDI platforms. If you want to learn more about 10ZiG and see customer feedback about us, then you can use this link here to get to the reviews area of our website to be able to find out more details and customer feedback about us. So with the 16.5 firmware, this applies to our range of in-house developed operating systems, which includes NOS, which is our zero client software-based operating system. So this is tailored for each VDI platform specifically, and there are 3 variants of this. So we have NOS-M, which accommodates Microsoft's AVD and RDP platforms. Then we have NOS-C for Citrix, and also NOS-V for VMware Horizon. PeakOS is our full thin client operating system. So this allows you to be able to connect to multiple devices or VDI platforms from the same device. But at the same time as well, this also can give you the ability to be able to use web-based applications using either Google Chrome or Firefox on the device. RepurpOS, this is our operating system for third-party devices. So if you want to convert a fat PC or a laptop, for example, into a zero client or a thin client, depending on the setup that you configure, then we can use the RepurpOS operating system. So NOS and PeakOS are designed specifically for our own hardware, and RepurpOS is essentially the same as PeakOS, but it is just for third-party hardware. But all of these operating systems, although they use the 16.5 firmware as a base, they can all be managed by the 10ZiG Manager server, which is our free endpoint management tool, which you can install on-premise or in the cloud in whatever situation you prefer. So a little bit of background on the firmware history. So some of you here today, you may still be using this firmware if you are already an existing 10ZiG customer. So the 16.3 firmware, this used an ICE window manager with a C++ custom Qt user interface for the actual GUI on the client side. We also, when we use this firmware, used to have to manage them fully through the MMC-based console, which is more of a traditional Windows-based application for full management. So that included, for example, editing of individual device configurations and also the templates. But as you can see here, looking at the screenshots, the look and feel between both the clients and the manager configuration screens was not aligned. So it looks very different from what you would see on the client side to what you saw within the management tool. Then we moved on to 16.4 firmware. So this was released a little while ago, and we did do another webinar earlier on this year in January with a colleague of mine, Matthew Phillips, actually, which looked into this in much deeper detail. So this basically brought in the HTML GUI interface, which basically harmonized our user interfaces across all of our Linux-based operating systems and also the 10ZiG Manager application. So what you saw basically when you went into a configuration screen on the client was what you saw, or very similar to what you saw when you went into the same configuration screen within the management tool. So with this firmware, it was based on an earlier Ubuntu kernel 2004, but this really was the main firmware that introduced the HTML GUI to our operating systems. But where we are now with the current firmware, this is 16.5 and very similar. So it's still using HTML GUI, same sort of common branch used for all of our operating systems, NOS, PeakOS and RepurpOS. The main differentiator here with 16.5 is that we've updated the Ubuntu kernel to 2204 long-term service. So that will provide support for the foreseeable future, but it also gives us the benefit of having wider hardware and driver support, which is beneficial, especially for the RepurpOS operating system, which we're seeing more interest in, and it gives us a common baseline for all of our partners as well to work on. So let's start off then looking at the first pillar that we sort of talked about in the contents, the discovery area. So the first thing to sort of discuss is device discovery, how you get your devices discovered and registered within the management console. So we're going to look at broadcast discovery. So this in the 10ZiG Manager server is enabled by and used by default. So basically this will send a broadcast message sent every 120 seconds, which can be configured later on if you wish to, but it will do that broadcast on port UDP 52500. So any clients in the same broadcast domain as the Manager server will receive potentially receive that broadcast and respond back to the Manager server. So those devices should then register, and they should then be seen and discoverable within the Manager server, so you can interact with them and provide further management features. The next discovery method is ping discovery, and again this is enabled by default. Unfortunately though, this does require some additional configuration to operate. So in a similar way, this sends a sort of a packet or message from the Manager server to locate any clients that are deployed. It does it on the same timer, so every 120 seconds, and it will send a unicast message basically to every IP address in a network address range that you've configured to the same port UDP 52500. So in this top right hand corner, we've got an example of the configuration screen where you can configure those network address ranges. So the benefit of using this is in a sort of default situation, you will be able to discover your devices that are in remote VLANs across a routed network, or potentially on a wide area network environment with multiple sites. Then potentially you can also detect devices that are deployed at those remote locations. The downside to using either of these two techniques is obviously the additional network load that those broadcasts will generate being sent from the Manager server to discover those devices. So we also have another method for client discovery, and this is slightly different because this kind of like reverses the registration process. So whereas the other two items use the Manager to send out the broadcast to discover the devices, this uses the client to automatically learn the address of the Manager and register itself automatically. So to be able to utilize this, you need to have a DNS server, and then within that we configure a DNS SRV record. So you've got two options here. You can configure a UDP SRV record if you're just using the devices with the standard internal ports. And again, that is for port UDP 52500. Alternatively, you can use the cloud connector, which is a component of the Manager server, which is useful for allowing devices to connect back to the Manager over complex networks where network security appliances might block the normal ports used for communication between the client and server. But then also the cloud connector can benefit you for deploying any remotely deployed devices at, say, home worker locations, connecting back over the internet. And also the cloud connector is required for any repurposed devices for the licensing mechanism as well. So this basically uses a HTTPS tunnel to be able to communicate between the server and the client. So the default port used here is TCP 443 for the cloud connector TCP SRV record. So the discovery process using one of these mechanisms is fairly straightforward. So the client will be deployed on the network. Ordinarily, it will do a DHCP request to learn its IP configuration, but as a part of that, the DHCP server will send it an option 15, including the domain it should look up for the associated SRV record. So the client then queries the DNS server for a specific record called _TZMGR_discovery. If that is valid, it returns the address within the record, and then the client will complete its DNS lookup if required using an FQDN, and once that is resolved, it will then register itself automatically with the manager. So the clients will do all of that process automatically when they are turned on or rebooted every time to connect to the manager server. So it's a much more efficient way of being able to get in your devices connected within your 10ZiG manager server. Unfortunately, though, obviously you need to have the DNS facility available to be able to set that up. So it's dependent upon your infrastructure of whether you can utilize this method. So just some client discovery notes. If you are using the DNS option to be able to resolve to the SRV record, then you would want to go into the settings here. So in the 10ZiG Cloud Manager settings, we can go in here and disable the broadcast discovery, ping discovery, and automatic discovery options, and that will just then stop the manager server from sending out those automated broadcast messages based on the timer configured within the application. Now there is another option available to us. So you can manually configure your 10ZiG 0 and thin client with the address of the manager server through the Cloud Manager agent applet within the operating system itself. So as you can see here, this is showing the screen where normally it would obtain that information using the DNS SRV record, but that's just been disabled, and we've just entered the address manually, which can either be an IP address or FQDN again to be able to register. Now that might be used if obviously the device is potentially going to be sent out externally, and they can't resolve the DNS SRV record because of that. So we would want the address to be entered in the template or in the configuration manually. And if that is the case, then we can configure this using a template during production of the units before they are shipped to you. Alternatively, you could isolate clients on a network and have them have the templates pushed out to the devices with this setting configured before they are then deployed remotely to be used. So they're the two main options for a manual configuration. So client discovery is considered best practice in live environments using the DNS SRV record lookup and should be implemented where possible. Ideally using the cloud connected TCP SRV record for maximizing functionality and minimizing any future changes. So if you set up the cloud connector with the TCP SRV record to begin with, you don't have to then come back at a later time if you do change any of your setup, for example, or using repurposed devices to be able to get those devices then connected and licensed back through the cloud connector. It's already done for you. Broadcast discovery and unicast discovery are good for getting a new installation up and running for POCs, test environments, and small deployments. But then you can also use manual configuration where suitable, because none of the above options fit the deployment requirements. So once your devices are registered into the 10ZiG Manager, then we can look at group organization and the ability to be able to auto-populate the groups using certain filters. So the groups allow you to logically manage clients based on organizational units, so it can split up your 0 and thin client estate, so you can manage them much more easily. And groups can be nested, allowing for more complex arrangements. So clients can be auto-populated into the groups when they register with the manager. So once you've, for example, they've gone through that boot process and they've registered with the manager, it will then go through any filters that match the device and populate the groups based on any matches. So some of the filters that we can configure, you've got the platform, you've got also IP address filters that can be set up. You can also filter on specific hardware models. So if you've got different 10ZiG hardware with different display interfaces, you might want to apply different templates to those. So we can actually specify filters for different groups using the model information. You can also filter on firmware versions, which can be useful performing firmware updates. But then there's also computer names and MAC addresses, and also cloud agent registration codes. So there are a lot of different filter options, which we'll see in a moment when we switch over to the 10ZiG Manager Console for you to be able to filter devices and auto-populate your groups. Just be aware that filters work on an AND basis and not OR, so will be added to any groups that match applied filters to that group. So potentially you may find that there are multiple groups which match the criteria of a single device, and that device could potentially be populated into more than one group. If that is the case, you can obviously then either modify the group setup so that the device only appears in one group, but just ensure that only one group is being used for any sort of auto client configuration, so it doesn't cause any potential management headaches down the road. So I'll show you that in a moment when we switch over to the Manager Console. But looking at the filters, this slide here just gives you some examples of filters that could be used. So you do have some wildcards that you can use within the filters. So for instance, a question mark can be used where the value is not known, but you know there should be a specific character there. And then a star is as standard for a lot of wildcards, pretty much a capture-all instance. So here we've got some examples where we filter on specific hardware models. So with a 10ZiG hardware, the first 2 digits normally identify the hardware series. The second 2 digits normally identify the operating system in use. So we're looking here for anything that's using 48, which would be a NOS operating system, a zero client device. Similarly, this is looking for 72. But we're just using a slightly different filter with a different wildcard at the beginning there. So that could be used to filter on your PeakOS thin client operating system devices. As you can see here as well, that the filters can be configured as either include or exclude. So that is important to note, as that can be quite a useful function for specific circumstances as well. But here we've got IP address filters, computer names, which is pretty standard as well, and MAC addresses. So MAC address filter can be useful for filtering again on on 10ZiG hardware. So all of our hardware will begin with the MAC address 00E0C5. So this filter here will look for that as the prefix. So you could filter those devices into a group for the 10ZiG hardware. Alternatively, you could exclude those devices, and if you were then filtering on the Linux platform, that would potentially allow you to be able to filter on repurpose 10ZiG devices. So we'll look at the filters in a moment when we switch over to the Manager Console. But once devices have been allocated into the groups, that's when the power of the groups can sort of come to the front. So this is where we can automate the configuration of the devices. So you've got the ability within the groups to obviously assign what we call a template of a device, so it can automatically configure it with a particular configuration, and you can add multiple templates within this window here. If you do have templates for like a single configuration setting, they can be added in here as well if you wanted to. You've also got the ability to use client auto naming to rename the devices within a group. So that could be to better identify it based on an organizational unit or department, for example. And you've got the ability here as well to either use an index or a portion of the MAC address of the client as well to better differentiate it from other devices within the group. And then finally, we can do updates of firmware at the group level as well. So this can be useful for initial deployment to get your devices up to the latest firmware level. And at the same time, we can use a template to configure the devices for that firmware as well. So there are a number of different options available for the firmware update process, which we'll look at a little bit later on in more detail. But for example, you can run the update process if the device has been idle for a number of minutes, perform the upgrade next time the device reboots, reset any clients to factory default, and download from a peer. So that is a really important option for if the clients are being updated at a remote location. We can have the ability to provision the firmware to a single device at that remote location, and that can then act as a peer and push out the firmware locally. So sort of there's no real sort of best practice as such for all of these things, but there's a bit of guidance really, because there's always more than one way to cook an egg to do things depending on the circumstances or the environment. Kind of like for a new deployment guidance for zero touch configuration, what we would normally want to achieve is to be able to deploy an initial device. And with that device, we would configure the client locally so we can get familiar with the local operating system, but also we can install any resource files that may be wanted to include within our template when we generate it within the manager server. So this could include background wallpapers, certificates, or additional printer drivers if required. And these can all be included within the template when it's captured from the manager server. But once that initial device has been set up, you then test it to ensure that it's going to operate effectively for all the different use cases that you need it to be used with. And then we can ensure that that device is registered with the 10ZiG Manager server using one of the discovery process that we talked about a few moments ago. Once the device is within the manager, we can then generate a template of that device, and we can also create a group to logically organize the clients depending again on the organizational units, and configure in the required auto population filters. And then that template we generate can be assigned to the group, and any firmware required or automatic naming criteria can be then configured on the group level as well where needed. So that will then hopefully give you an automated process so that any devices that are deployed on the network will be able to then automatically register with the manager using one of the discovery mechanisms looked at earlier. But then at the group level, they will be registered and filtered into the relevant group, and the templates and firmware, etc., will then be applied to that device. So almost giving you that automated zero touch configuration. So I'll quickly show you that within where you can set all of that up within the management console. Hopefully this will come through. Just looking at my web console here. So obviously, because we're using 16.5 firmware, as I mentioned, we are using the HTML GUI. So we're not using the MMC console now for the main management of these devices. We're using the web browser. So that will normally be using the link which is created when the application is installed on your 10ZiG Manager server. But just recommend obviously you use a more modern browser for some of the screens that are presented when using this interface. So Edge, Chrome, Firefox, for example, should be able to give you the full experience of using the console. But the other benefit of using the web-based console now is that it's much easier to access this from other locations. So if you wanted to from another machine, you could just enter the address of this server and be able to access the web console directly from there. So I do, whilst that's logging in, I'll just show you, I have got a client here which I've pre-configured, which is a NOS device. So we're going to pretend that that device has been set up initially. I've imported my background wallpaper, as you can see here, and also uploaded a certificate which is required for the environment that we're connecting to. I think that is now logging onto my storefront screen. So what we're going to do is basically use this as our sort of golden image and generate a template which can then be applied to a group. So then any additional devices will receive that configuration. Now, when you enter your template names, it's a good idea to use the firmware version that the device is using at the time, and also a date stamp of when you generated it. You can also do something like a version number if you need to. That's generated the template, which is available here. And then over here on this group, so if we pop in to see some of the filters here, so go to properties, and here we've got some filters to be able to add the device into this particular group. We're going to go to client configuration and assign the template. You can also change the name of the devices. So I could put, for example, firmware 16.5 36 as a prefix and a dash. And then you can either use an index of, say, 3 digits, which would go from 001 to 9999, or a portion of the MAC address as well. If we wanted to, we could then add a firmware package if we did need to update the devices that are coming into the group here. So that is being assigned, so that can then be pushed out to the client, and any new devices that matching the filters within this group. So we've got here the filter by platform, which is a mandatory filter. So because we're using 16.5 firmware, this is Linux 16.4 and later, but we've also got filters here for the firmware version. So we're looking specifically for devices running 16.5.36. There's also filter by MAC address. So we're looking for devices that are running 00E0C5, so 10ZiG hardware. You've got here a filter for question mark 48 star. So again, this is filtering on the NOS devices. And then filter by IP address range is being used here. The Cloud Agent registration code, that is really useful for externally deployed devices because that can match up devices to be able to be added to groups that are externally deployed coming in on public IP addresses. So just some other groups we've got here, just as an example, we've got RepurpOS, so some filters I've got set up on that. You've got filter by MAC address on here, and then filter by IP address as well. So in the MAC address, you'll see that we've got here a exclusive filter. So it's basically looking for anything running Linux that's not got a MAC address beginning 00E0C5. So that should match up any device running the RepurpOS operating system. So switching back to the PowerPoint, we'll then look at the next section with maintenance. So post-deployment management. So once you've got your initial deployment set up, the main things that you're going to be wanting to do is configure ongoing configuration changes, firmware updates, and doing processes using scheduled tasks. So configuration changes, just things to bear in mind with this, that client changes can be performed per client individually or using the groups or a scheduled task. So also with the HTML GUI and the 16.5 firmware, changes are applied immediately, and unless low-level changes are not made, no reboot or desktop refresh is required. So they will take effective immediately. Now there is a document that's been uploaded to the webinar which will notify you of any of the configuration areas that potentially could cause a reboot or a desktop refresh to occur. So that's just a useful document to make you aware of making any changes post deployment. Because if you change any of the items within a group template, for example, which is assigned to a group, those potentially will be pushed out immediately to the devices. So it could cause some issues to devices within the group. So just be aware of that, because now with the 16.5 firmware, if you look at the edit thin client group screen compared to the MMC console for the older 16.3 firmware, it used to be the case that on the groups, you had to first go into the edit configured client list and remove the devices from that area before a new template could be pushed out to the devices in the group. But that's no longer the case. So any changes you make to a template assigned to a group can potentially become effective in those devices immediately. So could cause some issues if you do modify that template and don't manage it effectively. So the best sort of practice for using this is that if you are in your console, if you want to make any changes to a template which is being assigned to a group, so this golden image here, for example, don't make the changes within that template itself. Just create a copy of it. So here, for example, version 2, and it could be, for example, because we've added a registration code, you can make changes to that duplicated template. Like that, for example. So you can then push out that template to an individual device to test it. When you're satisfied that that template is working as intended, and you want to then switch it over to the group level, you can come back into properties and then go back to the client configuration and then normally be able to select the edit configuration so that then you can specify the new template that you've just created. So that's basically what this slide covers here. So when you make configuration changes at the group level, ideally create a copy of the group template, make configuration changes to the group copy not currently applied to the group, and then deploy the template to a single or sample of clients. Test and ensure that the operational continuity is okay. And then once you're satisfied with the changes tested, allocate the new template to the group configuration so that it can then be deployed to your remaining devices. Firmware updates, so again, these can be deployed individually, by groups, or by scheduled tasks. So the firmware first has to be installed to the 10ZiG Manager before being available to be deployed. Some people do ask, is there a way to be able to pull the firmware off a web portal, for example, automatically within the manager? But no, there is a manual process, and we feel that kind of like minimizes potentially the number of problematic firmware deployments which can occur. So you have to do this manually. So it just basically makes it a little bit more complicated to do, in the sense that you have to initiate it. So firmware update guidance for groups, similar to a new deployment really. So update the firmware on a single client and reset it to factory default settings. So we always recommend that when you update the firmware to a new level, you generate a new template of that device. So we basically set the initial device back to factory default settings, then configure the client locally again in the same way as you did do for that sort of initial deployment. So again, installing any resource files, including a background wallpaper, certificates, printer drivers, etc., required for included in the generated template. Again, with the new firmware applied, test the configuration and ensure that it always is all operating in the same way as it was before. And again, when satisfied with testing being clear, you can then generate a new template for the new firmware level from the updated reconfigured client. And once that has been captured within the Manager console, you can then push out the new firmware and template to either your groups, devices within groups, or you could deploy it, for example, using scheduled tasks as well. There's no right or wrong way of doing that. It's entirely up to you whether you want to use the groups to do the firmware update, or if you want to do it using a scheduled task, for example, out of hours. So just on the scheduled tasks, so these can be useful for performing tasks out of hours or as part of a process. So again, these can be applied to individual clients or groups. So the frequency for when the task can be performed can be either once, on an interval. You can also do them on a daily basis or weekly basis, and some of the actions performed on the Linux-based clients. So if a device is offline and you support Wake on LAN, you can power on the clients. We can reboot the clients. You can also shut them down. You can update the device firmware, apply templates, factory default devices, but also you can display a system message if you want to notify the users of a, for example, a maintenance that's going to be performed. Then you could send them a system message which will appear on the Linux-based devices. But this just allows you to be able to create intricate sort of processes. So for example, here we've got a process which is updating the firmware out of hours. So it begins at 1 AM by turning on the devices using that Wake on LAN feature. Then at 1:15 AM, it does a factory default of the devices. Once that has been performed at 1:30 AM, we perform a firmware update, and then it applies a new template that's been generated from a device that's already been updated to that new version of firmware. Once that's been completed, it then shuts down the devices at 2 AM to save on the environment, and then ready for the end users to come in the morning and turn those devices on. So scheduled tasks can be great for performing maintenance out of hours if configured correctly. So looking at some support items then, so we've got the option to be able to do remote control. Obviously, this is fairly straightforward. So from the web-based interface, you can right-click on any devices that are online within the 10ZiG Manager console, and you can either reboot or shut down those devices, but you can also factory default them from the Manager console. Any offline devices, again, if Wake on LAN is available on the internal network, then you can also potentially turn on the devices remotely from the Manager console. You've also got the ability to provide remote shadowing. So this gives you the ability to connect to the clients from the 10ZiG Manager, from the web console itself. So this utilizes VNC in the background to perform this task. So if you're using the client connected to 10ZiG Manager server, just using the standard internal ports, then this will use the standard VNC port 5900. But if your client is connected to the manager using the cloud connector, then it will use TCP port 443. So there are some VNC startup options. So by default, it's set to on demand. So that just means it's secure in the fact that you can only connect to this client via VNC through the web console or the MMC console if you were using that for other purposes. If you wanted to connect to the clients using other VNC clients, then you can switch it to on boot. And then you could use something like Ultra VNC or Real VNC, or if you see it as a security risk, but you do lose the ability to provide that remote support, you can disable it entirely. So when you do log on to a client using the Manager console, it will actually change the background color of the client to blue, just to give a visual indication to the end user that the device is being monitored. You can also get some notifications. So for example, the device can provide an accept reject dialog box, so that when an incoming VNC connection comes through, it gives the end user the opportunity to either accept or reject that incoming connection. And there's also the ability to assign a client password here as well. So that's more to protect the sort of VNC session from the 10ZiG Manager side. So if the support technician goes away from their desk and leaves their PC unlocked, if someone else comes by and tries to attempt to shadow a device, unless they know the password that's been configured here on the client side, they'll be rejected the connection. So there's just some useful features on the support side of things that can be done for remote shadowing. But once you're shadowing, you can see everything on the client as well as potentially in the VDI session that they're logged on to as well. We've also added the ability to be able to download log files centrally within the Manager console for troubleshooting purposes. So this is a much sort of requested and useful tool, especially for devices that are deployed remotely away from the sort of organization. If you do encounter any issues and they need to be troubleshooted, potentially you can reproduce the issue on the client, and then from the Manager console, for example, you can go to the download logs and generate a package which is saved into the 10ZiG Manager image store. That can then obviously, with a ticket that you've raised with the support team, be attached and provided for further analysis and investigation. So security, so using the sort of a cloud connector for remote management security, there's a couple of options you've got here. So you've got cloud connector authorization, which allows you to be able to basically authenticate a client to a specific manager. So again, these are useful tools for devices that are deployed at remote locations across the internet, where you may be opening up access to the manager from the internet itself. So this shows an example. So ideally, if you're using the cloud connector, and again, this is dependent upon your infrastructure available. So you might have the 10ZiG Manager server here on the inside network, and then devices connected to it internally. We've then got a DMZ with another instance of the cloud connector. So any external devices are ideally connecting to the cloud connector here in the DMZ, and then that is connected to the internal 10ZiG Manager server to bridge the communication between those locations. So this is kind of like the best sort of scenario for deploying the 10ZiG Manager for external access. But again, it's dependent on whether you've got that available. If you don't have a DMZ, then you can just forward the TCP 443 from the router firewall directly to the 10ZiG Manager server, unless you've changed the port to something else. We can also secure the connection, the cloud connected connection using a certificate. So this is basically set up when you install the cloud connector. So you've got the option to use a self-signed generated certificate, which will give you the operational functionality, and it will encrypt any data being transmitted, but it won't authenticate the client server connection. So it is less secure in that respect, and that's why on the client side, the server certificate error action is just to accept the incoming connection. So you can upload your own certificates, enterprise or externally signed certificate, which can also be used for also the encryption and authentication of that connection. Now, there is also this this item here. So this is the Cloud Connector authorization. So this can be enabled through the Cloud Manager settings application on the Cloud tab underneath the advanced section. So we can basically configure an authorization code within the 10ZiG Manager server, and that can also be configured on the client side in the Cloud Manager agent configuration. So you can come into the Cloud Manager settings, security, and then underneath here you've got manager authorization code. So you just need to enter in there the value which matches with the authorization code configured on the 10ZiG Manager server. So that can be super useful, especially obviously for protecting your manager server from any potential devices externally deployed which could gain access or get registered with your manager server. But then also that can also be super useful if you've got multiple managers deployed on a large network environment, because then you can ensure that only specific devices are registering with the correct manager server. So along with that, we talked about this a little bit earlier on. Again, for cloud connected devices that are deployed remotely, we can use a registration code to be able to group those devices to better manage them. So because they will be coming in on public IP addresses, it's difficult to isolate on those. So again, we use for those remote units the registration code to capture those devices within the groups. Finally, the web console access. So this allows you to be able to lock down and set permissions for users that are going to be utilizing the 10ZiG Manager web console. So this is configured through the 10ZiG Manager role administration application within the 10ZiG Manager program group. And by default, you have two roles configured here. You have 10ZiG Manager administrators, but then you also have 10ZiG Manager technicians. These are set up so they've got different permissions. So obviously administrators can do everything, but then technicians can only do things like remote operations, rebooting, shutting down devices, shadowing them, but they can't edit templates or modify configurations for individual devices. Now you can create your own custom roles, and you can also add different members to this. So if you're 10ZiG Manager server is joined to your domain, you can then pull that information through from your Active Directory. So you could potentially do that from within here, but if you've got quite a large organization, that could be quite cumbersome to do through here. So ideally, probably the easiest way to do that is using the computer management on the actual 10ZiG Manager server. So first, if we go into computer management, local users and groups. So you can create groups within here, for example, like we've got this option here, 10ZiG Manager custom group, and then we've added our either different groups from Active Directory or individual members within here. Once that's been created through computer management, you can come back into the roles application here, and then you can select add roles. But instead of selecting your domain, you can just select the local machine. And as you can see here, we've got 10ZiG Manager custom group. So you can add that in and then modify the privileges for that group. within here as well. So that gives you a much quicker and easier way of adding users and groups from Active Directory by using the computer management first and then adding into the roles application for the 10ZiG Manager. So that pretty much covers all the topics that we were looking to cover today. Any questions, Ed, that have come through?
Yes, we have a few questions here. I appreciate everyone's attendance today, and thank you for your attention during the presentation. And thank you, Stu, for your great job.
No
now
problem.
We have a few questions here. Philip Marshall has asked us, what would be the best practice if using 10ZiG NOS devices remotely? For remote connected 10ZiG NOS devices, or for any 10ZiG that's remotely connected, there is a hard requirement to use the cloud connector configuration option. You have to use that so that your externally connected 10ZiG device has the ability to connect back to the public interface where your manager is piped out to, so that it can connect back into the manager for management and configuration. Alan Schreiber asked, what is the release cycle for NOS, PeakOS, and RepurpOS devices? Our release cycle is roughly 4 times per year. We run a full release about quarterly. We do release hot fixes in between for specifically found issues, whether they're customer found or whether they are found through our own internal QA processes. We do release those hot fixes in between our full releases. Alan had another question. Will firmware for legacy 16.3 devices continue to be updated? Legacy 16.3 firmware will continue to receive hot fixes related to specific issues. We will not, however, be releasing any further full release firmware for it. We do continue, and we will continue to support that 16.3 legacy firmware through our help desk for the foreseeable future. So we're not going to cut off any of our customers that are on the older legacy versions. We simply are not producing new feature sets within that version. If you need the newer feature sets, please feel free to go ahead and upgrade to our 16.5 firmware version, and we will continue to build those out there. Sean Mebbitt said, does 16.5.36 support backgrounds? I'm unable to use that option after moving away from 16.3, or does that require a license manager update as well to regain that functionality? When 16.5.36 released, the manager version that was alongside of it did not support the background functionality. If you go to our latest 5.2.0.3 manager, along with our latest 16.5.36.1 firmware, you can use those background images again. Stephen Jones said, is the VMware Horizon client bundled with PeakOS and RepurpOS just the standard Linux Horizon client, which would work with a view preferences config file and Horizon client launch command line options? Could we deploy that view preferences config file to the clients in the template config? You can and can't. You can use those same configuration settings, but you have to configure them via our GUI. You cannot configure those directly from the client using the configuration file. You can, however, access most, if not all, of those options from within the UI of the client itself, which then becomes a component of your template when you pull that off of the device for application to the other units. These are great questions. Thank you, guys. Arthur Christensen said, we are using NOS V0 clients in 16.3. We were able to use the resource installer app in the template configuration to add a wallpaper background. This goes back to what I was speaking about a minute ago with the backgrounds being supported in the latest 16.5.36 hotfix, as well as in the latest 5.2.0.3 manager.
Is that all of them, Ed?
Sorry?
Is that all of them?
No, we have a few more if you'd like. If you have a little bit more time. Any updates on when the 16.5 firmware will be available for deployment via the console instead of only through USB deployment? You can update to 16.5.36.1 directly from our legacy 16.3 branch through the console currently. That was just released last week. Again, Andres, you asked a similar question. Can you upgrade directly from 16.3 to 16.5? You can now do that with the 16.5.31 firmware. We have a lot of questions here. I'm hoping that we can get to all of these. We have, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to pick up as many as I can. In 16.5, when you change a group to a new auto configuration template, will it immediately apply to those templates? This goes back to what Stu was talking about during the demo with the change from the legacy configured clients list to the newer dynamically applied templates. If you make a change to your live template, it will absolutely apply that change the next time the device logs in. This is the reason why we want you to copy that template and make a change to the copy rather than making changes to the immediate provisioned template. Martin Jimerson said, will it ever be an option to just update the Horizon client and Zoom to make the update quicker and more reliable? One of the things that Zoom has required of us is to be able to update Zoom independently of the Horizon client, and this is because of their hard requirement of an update cadence every quarter now. Because of this, we now have to package the Zoom client separately, and unfortunately, there's no way to work around that requirement for us. It's something that we have to continue to support in order to be able to continue to provide you with the Zoom functionality. We've run out of time. I appreciate all of your great questions. If there were any that I was not able to get to, I absolutely apologize for that. If you would like to send those through to our help desk at support@10zig.com, we'd be more than happy to answer those. You're also welcome to email me direct at edr@10zig.com, and I will happily answer them there as well. Thank you so much for all of your attendance. I'll pass this back to Stuart.
Thanks, Ed. So just to finish off then, just want to say thank you to everybody for joining today, so new customers and old, and also there will be a lucky winner of a $100 Amazon card, so look out for that after the webinar as well to one lucky winner. So from all of us at 10ZiG, just want to finish off because this is the last webinar probably of the year, just wishing you all happy holidays and new year leading into 2024. So again, thank you very much for joining and your participation in this webinar today.